Hello everybody. I'd like to start by wishing every one of you a very happy new year. I hope 2025 brings you happiness, harmony, good health and hope. I'm the introverted astrologer, and I was hoping that 2025 would bring Prince William all of these things too. We know that this time in 2024 things were very hard for him. I've been looking at a few of his charts and there's good news and bad news. But very importantly, I know some of my viewers are concerned about the relationship between Prince William and Harry. And one of the charts is intriguing because it is indeed hinting that there could be a link with a sibling. And let's quickly recap on where the Prince was in January of last year, a month when things began to deteriorate at speed. This time in 24, his wife was about to undergo what was thought to be routine abdominal surgery, and then everything changed. Could we see anything in his chart at the time to show the tremendous difficulties he would face, not only with his wife's health, but with his father's health too? We have his natal chart here in the centre, and this time last year, transiting Neptune was of course thoroughly disturbing his equilibrium, because Neptune was forming an exact square with his natal Neptune, with his ascendant here, the descendant, and it drew within minutes of his Sun too during the year. Now, as Neptune looms large in this way by transit, we can find ourselves in the centre of acute confusion. The situations and people around us can throw us off centre because Neptune distorts, it undermines, it confuses, and by transit it will go retrograde and repeat these positions again and again. We can also consider what the Sun represents, because it can be our life path. It says something about our consciousness, but the Sun can also represent the Father, and this was very pertinent. The ascendant-descendant line running through the centre of our chart is the most sensitive angle in the chart, and this too was being broken down, showing acute confusion in his outward expression and his 7th house formal relationships. Again, relationships such as marriage. Moreover, Pluto in 2024, the outermost and most slow-moving of the planets, was forming a square with his midheaven and his IC. The midheaven represents how we project ourselves outwards to society, what our main role in our public life is, and the IC represents our heritage, our roots, and sometimes again says something about parental heritage and more often the father. There are other methods that we can use to assess the planetary influences on a particular year, and I would always personally look at a person's progressions, where we move one day forward in our ephemeris for every 1 year that the person has lived. We can see the progressed positions around the outside of the chart in the green glyphs. These particular measurements gave us a wealth of information for 24. We can see that his progressed Venus at around 15 degrees of Cancer was slowly moving to square his natal Saturn. And although I don't have the solar arcs up here, his solar arc Saturn, having moved forward around 42 degrees, was also opposing his Venus. Now, to have one Venus-Saturn contact in itself can be hard enough, but to have two connections like this is really emphasising the difficulties that can come with Venus and Saturn together, because they often mark times of remarkable unhappiness, despair, sadness, grief, even mourning, and for some people this is literally the breakdown of a relationship. Moreover, solar arc Chiron had moved forward and was forming a conjunction with his natal moon in January of last year. The moon can not only represent our emotions, but it can also represent the wife, and we know that Chiron tends to be prominent at times of wounding, of hurt, of pain, either emotional or physical. And we can see that the combination of Moon and Chiron together in this case quite literally represented a wounded or hurt wife. So taking these various factors into account, we would already establish that the Prince was going to be in for a difficult year. I would certainly wish for Prince William to have a reprieve from the intensity of 24, and to a certain extent he will. However, transiting Neptune isn't out of the way yet, and so we'll come back to this shortly. If we move on now and take a look at the Prince's progressions in 25, I want to show you something important which is shifting in his chart. So again, we have his natal chart in the centre, and the green glyphs around the chart are showing the positions of the planets as they are progressed for around the 1st of January 25. Now I want to pull your eye to his midheaven up here, the part of his chart which is telling us something about his public status. He has all these planets in Libra, and this is where we can see that something important is about to shift. The Prince's Mars is here. Libra energy is not the easiest placement for Mars, and it's said to be in detriment or exile in this sign. And this is because Mars cannot express its full range of desired actions against the Libran symbolisms of justice, partnership with others, the urge for harmony, etc. It hampers Mars somewhat, because Mars is the part of our psyche which desires action, exercising the will to get out there, to get the things that Mars wants, to use force, aggression or anger if needed. And again, Libra is not too comfortable with some of those things. But we can see that at the beginning of January, Mars is at 29 degrees and 56 of Libra. And so it's teetering on the edge of Scorpio. Once Mars enters Scorpio, it enters an arena where it is more powerful in its expression. This is a sign which it traditionally rules. And Mars here can be steadfast, determined, ruthless even. This is also the sign where Prince William's midheaven is, and although the progressed Mars is not going to reach this midheaven just yet, it will be very slowly moving towards it. However, this progressed Mars is not only going to make that sign change imminently, it is also going to connect with his Sun by trine exactly. So we have two very important things happening: the change of sign for Mars and a connection with the Sun. It's always very important when a progressed planet is going to change sign. And another thing that's very important in the progressions is if one of the planets is about to change direction. Now, Mars is going to stay in Scorpio for the rest of Prince William's life, I expect, and it will not turn retrograde in the progressions. However, there's another planet that will. And so while I've mentioned that Mars will connect with his midheaven in 29, I'll also quickly slip in that his Uranus was retrograde when he was born, and Uranus will change direction. That too will happen in 29, and so this could be an important year for him. But if we come back to that exact trine that's being formed between his Sun and his progressed Mars, this is telling us that the Prince is going to be much more energized at this time. There will be the will and the energy to strike forward to achieve the life goals he has, with intensity, with passion. There is immense strength here. His energy levels will be higher. His willpower will be immense. And so he has a couple of things in his favour as this year begins, and that's brilliant. Progressed Jupiter is more slow moving, but that too is saying something about Prince William achieving the goals he has, because Jupiter, symbolic of growth, expansion, benevolence and happiness, is in the area of his midheaven. In January, it's at 2 degrees and 22 minutes roughly. So it's in the area of it now. I'm not always entirely clear what Prince William's goals are, whether indeed he wishes to take the throne at some point, whether he would desire it to be sooner rather than later. I'm not sure. And there are a few other things in this chart which make me wonder if the prince himself is sure. But the connections that we are seeing between Sun and progressed Mars and progressed Jupiter nearing the midheaven certainly show us that the prince is probably aiming for something. I'm just not sure what. The progressed moon can also give us lots of clues about how a year will unfold month on month, because it moves at roughly a degree a month and makes various contacts with the natal planets. I've set the next 12 months out here. We can see that the progressed moon is in Capricorn at the moment. It's around 23 degrees. And so we know that it's very shortly going to exactly square with that natal Pluto. So January and February aren't entirely easy because this is quite an emotionally stressful contact. There can be some very deep undercurrents here. Very often there are themes of forced change. We may be wrestling for emotional control and not able to get it. There's often a power and control dynamic because Pluto is involved. And it's our emotional control which feels like it's being thwarted or undermined. It's not the end of the world and it will pass, but nonetheless it can be uncomfortable. And because Pluto also stands for regeneration, for transformation, what can often happen is that we find a lot of the things around us might even literally break down. Our appliances, the car, household repairs. It's as though things around us are literally breaking down in order to be reborn. Now, shortly after this, his progressed moon will move into a slightly easier aspect, a more pleasurable one for certain, where it trines with natal Chiron and Venus. And so this potentially brings feelings of being much more in tune with oneself. We have emotional equilibrium, a feeling of ease and respite. We can socialise more, mix with friends and contacts in ways which enrich us. Indeed, for single people, the trine between the progressed moon and Venus can sometimes mark a phase when we fall in love. Now, this progressed moon has been in the background energy of Capricorn for the last couple of years, and Capricorn is a very dutiful, very conservative kind of energy. It's keenly aware of hierarchy, of conventions and traditions, but this is going to change because the moon will move into Aquarius in very late July. Aquarius is a much more innovative energy, so this could mark a good couple of years where the prince is more open towards humanitarian goals. He might seek out progressive groups, those which have aims of social improvement and philanthropy. Aquarius can also be quite a changeful energy. The moon will square with Jupiter around July and August, so this is a time to guard against excessive hopes and expectations, excessive spending, excessive everything. And there will be a sextile with his Uranus shortly afterwards. Sextiles don't always amount to much. Potentially though, especially given that it is between positive fire and air energy, it could manifest in an opportunity for change that the prince can take if he wishes, something which enlivens and invigorates his life in a minor way. I must also add, by the way, that because the progressed moon is going to change into the sign of Aquarius halfway through this year, I do find personally that the whole sign position of the progressed moon is often the more accurate. And so this places the progressed moon now in the third house. And what does the third house symbolise? It's the house of communication, of our neighbours, our community, our short travels, our education, but also amongst its significances are, of course, siblings. If we come back to the main progressed chart, we can also see that this progressed moon is very gradually inching towards an opposition with the progressed sun. When the progressed moon exactly opposes the progressed sun, this is called a progressed full moon. Because the moon only moves at around 1 degree a month by progression, it won't exactly oppose the sun until around 2026, a bit later in the year. When this progressed full moon becomes exact, The Prince will be in the part of the major lunation cycle, where we can anticipate culminations, achievements, not necessarily guaranteed to be successes, but certainly the fruition of our efforts over the preceding years, for better or worse. This tells us that the Prince is now in the part of the lunation cycle which we call the progressed gibbous moon. If the full moon represents fruition and the culmination of the things we have worked for, then the gibbous moon represents a phase when the soul vaguely senses that it is approaching a time potentially of triumph or great achievement, but the soul is also aware that it isn't yet there. And so there can be great impatience during this gibbous phase. This is a time when we may overdo things through sheer impatience to get on and achieve our goals. So we may overdo work. We can burn ourselves out at both ends. We might be impatient and neglect our health. We have a shorter fuse and we are wrestling with more frustration and a shorter temper. And this is the phase that the Prince will be in leading up to mid-2026. Now, we did look at the transits that Prince William had been receiving from Neptune in 2024. Neptune was hammering his chart. He really was in a difficult patch. And the problem is that Neptune hasn't quite finished, because it is still going to move forward and square his natal Sun again. We've already seen that the Sun can represent our consciousness and our life path, and that Neptune can knock us off course a little. But we also could see that the Sun may well have been symbolic of the Prince's father, the King. And so father issues may not yet be entirely finished. There's a spectrum of possibilities when Neptune squares the Sun. And so I'm keeping an open mind as to how this one will play out. I'll put the dates up on the screen for times when Neptune is within around a degree of orb. And you may also have heard astrologers talking about the Neptune-Saturn conjunction that's going to take place this year in the first degree of Aries. Well, this one isn't quite such good news for poor Prince William. Saturn will approach this area of his chart and square his ascendant and then his Sun. Saturn will get up to roughly 2 degrees of Aries before it turns retrograde. I'll put the rough times up on the screen for when Saturn is entering within a degree of orb to the ascendant axis and the Sun. Times when the Prince is likely to start feeling the initial impact of this. And how does it feel when we have Saturn affecting our chart in this way? Well, it does sort of tie in with what I've been explaining about the phase he is in with the relationship between the progressed moon and the progressed Sun. The time when we have a lot to do can indeed become very tired, burn ourselves out. Saturn on the Sun can mark a time of trials and tribulations, because we will almost certainly experience some adversity. We can be sure that not all external factors in our life are going to be working in our favour. The Sun can also say something about our health and vitality, and Saturn can lower our vitality and potentially bring health issues. At the Prince's age, I'm not particularly expecting big health problems, but this would be a difficult transit, certainly, for somebody who was much older or had significant bad health issues to start with. The biggest challenge with this Saturn connection with the Sun and the Ascendant is going to be how to deal with the adversities that present themselves. There's a lot to be said for focusing on the things in life that do work and divesting ourselves of anything that isn't working well if we possibly can. If we can streamline life in this way, then this transit doesn't need to bring us to our knees, because it will also be simultaneously squaring the ascendant and the descendant. we can expect some tests in both our life direction and in our close personal or formal relationships. I think we deal with Saturn a lot better as we get older and more experienced. And although we might feel like we are wading through thick treacle, we do get better with doing this with time. So the Prince may also be considering his close relationships, how he has invested energy in relationships with certain people, and whether these relationships are worth the time they take, whether they are viable, with Neptune repeating its square to his ascendant and sun. There might also be the repetition of what the Prince has already come through anyway, in terms of needing to be flexible in our direction and understand that nothing is guaranteed. We had also seen that transiting Pluto had been squaring his midheaven and IC in 24, and that Pluto moves so very slowly that this isn't out of the way until the end of this year. So that intense pressure and transformation of public role, of family life, is going to remain. When Pluto squares our midheaven, we can have a feeling of inevitable change that we are unable to avoid, whether we like it or not. We would like to have a choice, but transits by square often don't present us with a choice, and there could even be power struggles and resistance as we feel coerced in a direction that we don't want. And because there is that simultaneous square to that IC, representative of family, of heritage and roots, that too can come under significant pressure with an impact on our domestic life. So home life may have some tension. However, the Prince has come thus far with this transit, and so we have no reason to doubt that he will maintain his composure and determination and move with it. And this difficult transit will be out of the way by the time he moves into 26. There is a lot that we don't see with our royals. We don't see the things that happen behind the scenes. So as ordinary folk, we can only be sure that this dynamic exists, and that behind the royal curtains there have been substantial stresses and strains with these transits from the outer giants. So we'll bear that in mind as we now move on and have a look at the solar return for the Prince this year. So here in the centre we have the chart for the Prince's solar return spanning June 25 through to June of 26, and this is a chart which is cast for the exact moment that the Sun returns to its natal position of 0 degrees and 6 of Cancer. We have already looked at the solar return for the Princess, and we could see from her solar return that she was doing okay, but would still very much be dealing with issues of lower energy. Her health is still in a recovery stage, but we could see that she had positive things coming for her in 25. And one of the things that was striking in her return chart was that there was a trine between her solar return Sun and her solar return Moon. And indeed we can see a positive aspect between the Prince's Sun and Moon in this return chart too. Although they aren't exact, the Moon is making an exact sextile with Jupiter. That Neptune-Saturn conjunction that will take place this year is showing up in the 10th house of this chart, whether we are Placidus or whole sign. So it's a case of brakes on, uncertainty, difficulty. Public life is going to be harder for the Prince to maintain during this 12 months. But other things that we can keep an eye on when we look at solar returns are whether planets have recently left more difficult territory and have entered signs where they are more comfortable. And so the Moon is around 2 degrees of Taurus. It is separating away from Chiron, and the Moon is said to be exalted in Taurus. So the Moon can represent emotions and can also literally represent the wife or the mother. And I think this is boding well. There is that exact sextile with Jupiter too. And I don't personally have great concern about the princess's recovery. I think she will continue to do well. Venus too is happy in Taurus because this is a sign where it is said to be in domicile, in its natural territory. It's a sign which Venus rules, and this too is looking good. Back in June 24, the solar return for the prince had an ascendant which fell in his natal 4th house, the 4th house of family, roots, security, potentially a parent too, in which case perhaps more likely it would be the father. So 4th house issues were dominant between June 2024 and June of 2025. This solar return is flagging up a different ascendant, an ascendant which correlates with the prince's natal 8th house. So we'll look closer at that shortly, because the 8th house is of course very intense. It relates to beginnings and endings, potentially sometimes to crisis. And the sign on the ascendant is Cancer. What I had specifically wanted to draw your attention to, though, is that it's very important if things fall on an angle, and most astrologers would consider the angles of the solar return quite closely. And we can indeed see a Mercury here in Cancer, and it's also in the degree of the node, a very close aspect indeed. This node too is emphasised by being on the midheaven. Now, we did look at the position of the progressed moon for the prince being in the 3rd whole sign house, and I explained that amongst the significances for the 3rd house are the matter of siblings. Well, here we have Cancer, which can represent family. Mercury has very similar symbolisms to the 3rd house. It is our mental processing, our communications, our interactions, short distance travel. But again, it can be siblings. And when we see the node appear, this often implies some kind of association with others around issues to do potentially with siblings, although certainly with communication. And Cancer can relate to family. This could quite literally be a family sibling. And so this was where I began to wonder if there may indeed be some kind of communication opening up, a link, the beginnings of possibly pulling in tandem. I really don't know. We are always examining a spectrum of possibilities. I couldn't rule out that perhaps there was formal contract, again another one of Mercury's symbolisms, to do with property, family, home life in some way. The ruler of this Cancer background is, of course, the moon. A moon which is very much at ease in the sign of Taurus and is forming that exact sextile with Jupiter. So the backup team is strong, as happy and positive. Here we're coming back to the prince's natal chart. And around the outside of this chart, we have those solar return positions that we were just looking at. The solar return moon is very closely on his IC, and so this is emphasising the ongoing importance of the prince's domestic life, his family life, concerns around home. But because of the special relationship between the moon and Jupiter, I personally have no doubts that the princess is going to continue making a recovery. The moon is said to be exalted in Taurus, and Jupiter too is exalted in Cancer. The exact aspect between the two is most encouraging, and we can see Mars falling in too. We know that this year is going to contain some obstacles for the prince, and the solar return did have quite a few of the aspects which we call quincunxes or inconjuncts. So the prince will certainly need to make a lot of adjustments and work in as fluid a way as possible, with some difficulty and strain, but there is no reason to suspect that he will not manage this. On a final note, eclipse season starts up soon, and the first solar eclipse of the year is going to fall at around 9 degrees of Aries. This will be in March, towards the end of March. And this is an eclipse which is also going to be partially visible across Europe and the UK. We can sometimes be hesitant about eclipses which aren't going to be visible in the country where we're resident. But in this instance, given that the eclipse will exactly oppose a personal planet, the Prince's Mars, we will most likely see some impact. How will that play out? Well, this eclipse is quite a physically expressive one, and it can speak of high energy and a need to let out that energy, and this could be experienced in a very positive or exhilarating way. We may take up a new sport or do something which requires a great deal of our physical energy, and this could be a positive and exhilarating experience all round. But simultaneously, it is in opposition to Mars, the planet which speaks of energy. And so this would also be a time where it would be wise to be cautious against taking unnecessary risks, because that energy can also manifest as an accident. The return Mars is also in square to the Prince's natal Uranus, so he could do with being discerning around the activities that he pursues now. I know I still have a couple of royal videos to put together, but something that's caught my eye is the volume of predictions and gossip which is currently surrounding Harry and Meghan. There's a plethora of articles and videos which are predicting a split up this year, as some of these predictions are indeed coming from very well established psychics with a large following. So what I'm going to do in the near future is have a look at their charts for this year with that in mind. Am I on the bandwagon of those people that dislike Harry and Meghan? No, I am not. I like to keep an open mind and take people as they come. So I have no vested interest in predicting any split up. Moreover, because there is a young family involved, that would be the last thing I would hope for anybody. But nonetheless, I will take an impartial look, and I'll have my conclusions with you soon. And between now and then, do take the very best care of yourself. I hope 2025 is unfolding on a positive note and that you and yours are thriving. Take care.